I am joined in the studio by Dr. Modupe Taylor Pierce. He joins me this morning for us to have a conversation, the Maiden Africa Leadership Conference, Ghana, and we are talking about this beautiful program. Dr. Modupe is a scholar that's West Point, Cornell, and then Capella University, and a practitioner of leadership, management, and organizational development. He's a passionate Pan-African. Modupe is dedicated to transforming Africa through good leadership. He was the founding dean of the African Leadership University's School of Business in Rwanda and Mauritius. And so I'm privileged to have a very learned man in the studio. Though behind the scenes, we got to realize we were illiterates sitting here. It's good to have you, sir.
Thank you so much.
And
I am grateful for the opportunity to speak with you and with your audience.
Yeah, I'm hoping you're doing well. How's been your stay here?
It's been wonderful. Ghana is a second home to me. I grew up in my early years here from 1980 to 86. And so coming back here always feels like coming home. And I always say Akwaba to myself.
Then Akwaba to you.
Thank you.
Have you, since you've been here a couple of times, which of our meals have you tried?
Oh, I personally am a big fan of kenke. Dokno, especially with fish and pepper. Whenever I can get the opportunity, I love to have some apapensa.
Hey,
but that one is that one is not too easy to find everywhere. So I make do with the kenke.
Well, let's talk about us as Africans. And, you know, the concept of leadership. I don't know if, whilst you've been here, you've been following the conversation, you know, we've been talking about leadership being the bane of Africa. We've been talking about, you know, whether they travel, what they see out there, they can't replicate that here in Africa and all. When we talk about leadership, from where you said, what constitutes leadership for you?
So, leadership at its very core is basically influence. And every one of us is a leader. You are a leader, I am a leader. Because the first person we lead is ourselves. The key question, though, is whether we are good leaders or we are bad leaders. And generally, when leaders make good decisions or optimal decisions, like they say, you shall know them by their fruit. You get positive outcomes. And when they make poor decisions or suboptimal, then you get negative outcomes. And the only variable is the lag time between the decision and when you see the outcome. Just like how some fruit, some plants, you plant today, you get the harvest in 1 month, and others, you plant today and it takes 4 years for you to get the harvest. That's how leadership is. But ultimately, it is influence. And everything we see around us is the result of decisions made by leaders. Even this studio that we're here at today exists today because a leader made a decision. It may have been 10 years ago, it may have been 1 year ago. And if that leader had made different set of decisions, we may or may not have had this studio, or we may have had a much better and bigger studio.
Interesting. Now, you talked about good leadership and bad leadership. Is that not relative? Because you were talking about the measurement of outcomes, the fruit. Is that not relative?
It is only relative to what the desired outcomes were.
Exactly.
So in other words, if my desired outcome, just to put it in very basic terms, is to have $10 million in the bank 5 years from now, then if I result in 5 million 5 years from now, that's not success, right? But if my desired outcome was $1 million and I get 5 million, then that is success. So it's relative, but not relative to just external people's standards. It's relative to what the organization and by default the leader had as a vision or as a goal. So whether it's at a country level where a leader might put out a manifesto or put out a vision for Ghana or any other African country, then you measure the effectiveness of their leadership by the results against what they promised.
Interesting, because my mind is running wild as we are having this conversation as to what constitutes leadership. I'm thinking about the late Muammar Gaddafi. May he so rest in perfect peace. I'm thinking about Nkrumah, for instance. I'm thinking about your own president. I'm thinking about others who, by virtue of their vision, were able to set up certain structures within their countries. And yet, from afar, some people said, because of the lack of a certain ingredient or a certain measuring metric, and so they are not good leaders. For instance, if you take the case of Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi had set up systems that made the people comfortable, and somebody sits somewhere and says, okay, he's not practicing democracy, and so regardless of all the successes that have been chalked in terms of the economic empowerment to the people, provision of shelter, medical facilities, and co, that ain't good leadership. How does that play out?
Well, the good news about when it comes to looking at leaders is that the measurements are objective.
Okay.
You notice I said it is based on the outcomes that the leader himself or herself had projected and had stated. So, if Muammar Gaddafi had not put out a democratic Libya as an objective, then for somebody else to say, well, you didn't achieve that, is about as effective as somebody saying to me, well, you didn't end up after 30 years of marriage with a fifth wife, and therefore you have underperformed. And I would say, well, that was not my objective. My objective was to end up with one wife after 30 years. And if I met that, then I have met success.
Okay. So then let's talk about political. I just want us to have a holistic conversation, you know, because you talk about political leadership in Africa, and sometimes the complaints you'd hear people make is the fact that our leaders are not running the continent well. Do you share such a thought?
First of all, that kind of a comment, I must say, is way too general to be able to say yes or no to. So there are certainly some leaders that are underperforming, okay? And at a political level, you by default are talking about national presidents. And there are some that are performing. And again, performing against the standards or the outcomes that they themselves had declared for their countries, whether it's in their manifesto or in speeches that they had given, okay? And so there are certain clear examples of countries that are performing, okay? So for example, the most obvious is Rwanda. There's also Mauritius, where the leaders are achieving...
You know the West would disagree with you if you cite Rwanda as a country where the leadership is supposed to be meeting its targets, because, you know, the remarks, the headlines and the articles when it comes to freedom of speech, when it comes to all of that in your country, the West doesn't see that as good leadership, do they?
And when did the West become part of Africa's stakeholders?
Exactly.
So the West, and any other participant, okay, that is not part of Rwanda's stakeholders, is not relevant to the question of whether President Kagame is a good leader. What is relevant is whether the outcomes that he stated that he wants to achieve for his country are achieved. Now, if in the process that means that he upsets the interests of Russia or the United States, so be it.
But you know, it's a global...
At the same time, it is a global... We are in a global community. But the key thing for African leaders that we have to understand, and this is one of the reasons why Africa remains poor, is that we have maintained a mindset of trying to serve a foreign master and oftentimes at the expense of our national interests. Okay. So there are many times when our interests are aligned with those of non-African nations. And there are times when our interests are simply not aligned. And as a president, as a leader, one has to have the courage to be able to say respectfully but firmly, no, we will not go along with your interests in this situation because we have certain national interests. And a clear example of that is, for example, the Africa Free Trade Agreement. There is a clear understanding that when Africa trades and operates as one bloc, it will come at the expense of the interests of certain non-African countries. But does that mean that we should not pursue that? Absolutely not. When Rwanda says that we will no longer accept used clothing from the United States, that certainly affects the United States' interests, okay? But Rwanda has interests to protect. They have jobs that they want to make sure that their young people are getting by sewing their clothing. They have industries that they want to make sure are not undercut by free stuff coming from abroad. Similarly, there are other policies that our African leaders need to adopt and certain decisions, but they take courage because you have to be careful about how, in many ways, you deal with the international community because sadly, we have had a history for the last 50 years of from time to time, countries outside of Africa sowing seeds of discord, distrust, and even coup d'etats against African countries. And so one must make sure that you balance those things out. And that's all part of being an effective leader.
Now, the interesting question would be then that the module of governance that we are running, I don't know how to describe it, whether it's democracy, whether it is monarchical, whether it is dictatorship, whichever form we may want to talk about. Is Africa running a governance system that aids in its drive to progress, to develop?
Once again, I'm going to take it country by country because each country, it is too easy to assume that Africa is one country. We have 54 countries and hundreds of different languages and thousands of unique cultures within Africa. So are most of the African countries running a form of democracy? That is true. And if you look at the trend in Africa, the trend has been moving towards democracy, towards a system that enables for a change of government without the use of bullets and guns. Okay, and for many of those countries, that is positive. In Malawi, 2 years ago, there was a system at the ballot box, and that was even challenged then at the judiciary, and the judiciary overturned an election that favored the incumbent. And that is how Lazarus Chakwera came to become the president of Malawi. That is a system of checks and balances and governance that has worked for Malawi. Now, in other countries, they do similar things. But some countries, take again Rwanda, has a system that is quasi-democratic. And again, the results speak for themselves. So each country, just like China, has to find its system of checks and balances and governance that works for its people, for its culture, and delivers the results that both the leader and the cultures want. And one last word on this. You see, one of the things that we have to realize, ladies and gentlemen, is very few leaders wake up every morning in Africa saying, how can I mess up my country today? Or how can I mess up my organization today? Or how can I mess up my family today? So at the end of the day, they want optimal results. The key question is whether they're making the decisions that will yield those optimal results.
Interesting. So all these questions I'm posing was to give you, the viewer and the listener, an idea of the depth of the individual that I'm talking with, to give you a sense of his understanding and appreciation of leadership when we are talking about the continent. And I'm sure you've had a fair idea. So let's go back to the issue that brought us here, which has to do with the Maiden Africa Leadership Conference. When is it happening, and who are the speakers that we should expect?
So the Maiden Africa Leadership Conference is a learning conference organized by African leaders for African leaders. Now, we organized this conference, we started in 2019 because we recognized that there was a need in the market. What is that need? The need is that the vast majority of African leaders, when they take up the position of leadership, and I'm not just talking about political leaders, church leaders, company leaders, community leaders, big and small, elected and appointed, when they take up that position of leadership, usually do not have all the information and the knowledge that they need in order to be successful. So they need to be placed in a learning environment where they can acquire the knowledge and the awareness so that they can make the optimal decisions that will result in the objectives that they have being achieved. Now, for many of our leaders, the vast majority, over 99% of them, they don't have the opportunity to do this. And the way to do this is by being in peer learning environments, by also receiving executive coaching, which is basically a thought partnership with one-on-one meetings with a coach. Now, in many other parts of the world, this is the norm for leaders. But in Africa, the general assumption is on that day that you are given the mantle of leadership, there is a spiritual halo that falls on you, and suddenly you know what to do, you know all the answers. And that could not be farther from the truth. So everywhere in Africa, every week, we have leaders making decisions in a fog of lack of awareness. And this is what is causing us to have the suboptimal outcomes that we don't want because of the decisions. So the Maiden Africa Leadership Conference is a 2-day event where we have small group learnings, leaders facilitated by professional coaches with keynote speakers and topic deliverers who will prompt topics. And this year it's going to be in Accra on the 14th and 15th of June at the Marriott Hotel. And it's going to feature some speakers that I'm very excited about, including, for example, the CEO of Kenya Airways, Alan Kilavuka, who is going to talk about some of the challenges that he has been able to overcome at Kenya Airways. I'm sure we all know that Kenya Airways has gone through some trying times lately. We're also going to have some exciting leaders like Ruth Zaipuna, who is the CEO of NMB Bank, who's going to talk about the challenges of transitioning from being a CFO to a CEO. It's a lot harder than it looks. We're also going to be, I'm very excited about one of our homegrown leaders right here in Ghana, Apostle Eric Nyamiche, who is the chairman of the Church of Pentecost, the church that spans 150 countries worldwide. And he's going to share about how they have been able to expand into so many countries using far less capital than many of us in the business community would have imagined. These are the kinds of learning environments that we're going to have. And when you come to the Maiden Africa Leadership Conference, you will leave with a solution to whatever that problem is that is keeping your organization from the success that you want it to have.
All right, so we have 30 seconds to end the conversation. Again, time, venue, and I think your final words.
Thank you very much. First of all, we're excited to bring the Maiden Africa Leadership Conference to Ghana. This is a Pan-African conference that we've held in multiple countries, and this year we're doing it in Ghana. This is a fabulous opportunity for Ghanaian leaders, for CEOs of medium-sized companies, large-sized companies, for leaders of state-owned enterprises, for church leaders, for youth leaders, to be able to come together and be fed and acquire some skills and knowledge to be successful in running their organizations. I'm excited about what Ghana can do as it leads Africa into a bold new century. It is not by accident that the Free Trade Agreement Secretariat was housed in Ghana. It is not by accident that Ghana was one of the first countries to get independence. And I believe that the examples shown by Ghanaian leaders will chart a course for the rest of Africa to lead Africa into a century where we are not just a low-income continent, but we are a high-income continent with successful people.
I'm grateful that you joined us this morning. Is this for free?
No, not at all. That is one of the mindsets that we are getting rid of in Africa.
Okay.
Too many of us want good things for free. Okay. And the only people who get things for free are beggars. Okay. This conference is a paid conference. Okay. And if you go to the website, bcaleadership.com/MLC, you will see what the fees are. It's a 2-day conference, and depending on whether you are coming in from outside or you are registering here locally, the price is a little different. I believe those who register here locally, the price is around $250 per person for the conference. So I look forward to seeing you here. It's a great investment that you will yield a lot of benefit for.
I'm grateful, Doc, that you made time to join us this morning.